righty. I think we're good. So, good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you may happen to be, all of my wild darlings. Lovely to see you. Those of you who have shown up or are soon to show up, and or those of you who see this later, that's okay too. We don't have to be live. That's why we record these things because, it's the modern world and we can do things like that. Anyway, good to see you. Good to be here. I'm Tad. I will be here for about the next hour. I am reading tonight some more from T.H. White's, from the larger book of The Once and Future King. But specifically, I'm reading the first volume, which is called The Sword and the Stone, and is about the childhood and early life of King Arthur. At least in T.H. White's version. And of course, there's a great deal of question as to whether Arthur was even a real, actual figure. He is, like many people whose historical roots are somewhat dubious, he has had a great many legends attached to him. But there's, I was actually talking about this the other night with somebody, probably poor Deborah, who has to listen to me ramble on about these things. There's all kinds of theories about if there actually was an Arthur. Was he a Celtic king who resisted the Anglo-Saxon incursion? I say incursion knowingly, since there's a lot of question now as to whether it used to be called an invasion, like the Anglo-Saxons just came over in boats with swords and torches and just like killed everybody and became the dominant culture in England, when in fact more recent science like DNA and stuff like that and archaeology suggests that it didn't quite work that way, that there was a great deal more intermingling, peaceful intermingling, and that very possibly, as often happens in these cases, that what is seen in retrospect or through the lens of history as an invasion or a usurpation of the place of the folks who are living in an area originally. And of course, this particular theme has been promulgated throughout history, going back to the Stone Age and the different cultures that began to move through Europe. But in fact, oftentimes these things are not, in fact, invasions or replacements, and are in fact a new culture which is brought in by people who've come in, but not necessarily by conquest, and then spreads to the locals. And in many cases, it's been discovered that the whole idea that the Anglo-Saxons came in and wiped out the local Celts is not quite what actually happened. The Britons were mainly remained, but they did intermix with the Anglo-Saxons, and they picked up the culture and things like that, and that became the dominant culture in most of what is now England. But of course, the Celtic cultures persisted in places like Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall. Anyway, sorry, but so one of the theories about King Arthur is that he was a Celtic king resisting Anglo-Saxon incursion. Maybe some truth to that there. I've heard other theories that he was actually a Roman general, one of the last of the remaining Romans in Britain, and that he, was a catalyst for forces to keep civilization going or whatever. I mean, there's many ideas. The main thing about Arthur, though, is it's a great and classic story. In fact, it's so important to the British national character and the British sense of self that it's the Arthurian legends are called the matter of Britain. Anyway, so there are many good books that have been written about the Arthurian sagas. Obviously, this one is my favorite, The Once and Future King, but for instance, Thomas Berger, who is best known for Little Big Man, which was a great novel and a wonderful movie with Dustin Hoffman, about a young white guy who is taken away by Native Americans and raised by them, and not in a traumatic way. Traumatic, not dramatic. But anyway, so Thomas Berger wrote a book called Arthur Rex, I believe. I'm trying to remember the name, which is really good, which is another good version of The Matter of Britain. Of course, there's the famous, now slightly disgraced Marion Zimmer, well, more than slightly disgraced, the Marion Zimmer Bradley, Mists of Avalon. There are, of course, the really well-known books about Merlin, the Crystal Cave, etc. I can't think of the writer's name. Mary Stuart? No, I may be mixing that up with her Greek mythology stuff. But anyway, I think Mary Stuart. Anyway, doesn't matter. So there have been many, many, many versions of the Arthurian saga. Some of them are explicitly, based mostly on the idea of chivalry and knighthood. Others have a more religious cast to them because of the Grail quest. One of the great things about any of these legendaria, to make a plural out of a singular that often gets used, one of the great things about these legendaria is that they can be looked at from all different kinds of angles. And as I think I mentioned when I was first starting to read The Sword and the Stone, T.H. White has a very specific take on things. He's a bit of an antiquarian. He's a bit of an historian. He is also somebody who is extremely interested in how things actually work and about the wisdom of people who actually work with things and animals and all that, like close up. So he's he learned how to ride so he could go on the hunt. Not that he was particularly interested in hunting the animals per se, but he was fascinated because it was such a part of human civilization or history. I mentioned he learned how to be a falconer and raised a goshawk, I believe it was, and taught it to hunt in the traditional falconers or falconry sort of way. He learned how to fly a plane. This was like in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when planes were a lot less safe than they are now. He learned how to fly, I believe, a biplane, which is what they had available for learning how to fly in the days when he started. He was an avid fly fisherman, fascinated by that and the whole art and culture that went with it. He was just fascinated by things. And in that way, I think I've always felt a great resonance with myself. If there's anything that I like, it's learning more about things. And things includes people. I don't mean to suggest things like inanimate objects. I mean just learning more about people, about science, about art, about anything. And T.H. White was clearly like that. Who knows, maybe at some point he wrote a really good children's, or what we would now call like a young adult book or an all ages book, called Mistress Masham's Repose. Which is about a girl who is stuck at a country house because her parents have gone away somewhere. It's been a long time since I read it. I don't remember all the details, but a girl who is living in this kind of tumble-down old country house and discovers that refugees from Lilliput, as in Gulliver's Travels, as in the tiny little people, that there are Lilliputians living on the property way far away from the house in, a little enclave of their own, that they got there from Lilliput and have lived there ever since. And it's a marvelous story. I might actually, maybe I'll read that at some point, because very few people I know have read it other than other writers who know T.H. White's work. But it's a very cool book and full of really all the things that a young person's book should be. I mean, it's first of all, it's not written down. As I said, it's technically an all ages book, but it's very much something that a grown up can enjoy. The points that it makes are extremely well made and are not preachy, but are about learning the hard way about things. Anyway, didn't mean to get off on a long thing about Mistress Masham's Repose, but it's an excellent book. If you haven't read it, I can't swear that I'm going to read it on this series of readings, but if you see a copy in a library or in a used bookstore or something, I'm sure it's well, not maybe not out of print, but it's not easy to find these days. Excellent book. Anyway, so I'm going to pop over before I start reading here and see who all has popped in. And I see Christina is here. And I see Melissa. Hello, Melissa. And I see James. Good to see you, bud. Suzanne and Cliff. Well, a lot of Americans here for a late night broadcast. Anamika is here. Rosalba. Sandra. Christian Fabricius is here. Chris Fab. Ivan, my old buddy. Hello, Ivan. Wouter's here. Petra. Nikki. Hello, Nikki. Mark checking in, presumably from Yorkshire. Nicole, good to see you too. Carol, Christy, and Penny are the ones who have posted stuff so far. But anyway, so just to give you a quick update, everything here pretty much like normal. I'm working away now on The Splintered Sun. I'm up to about chapter 9 and about 120 pages or so. This is not, in my mind, it's going to be more like War of the Flowers kind of length of book. Not a big, massive tome like To Green Angel Tower or The Navigator's Children. But I mean, it's a story with lots of characters and lots of things happening and lots of changes of scenery. So it's not going to be 100 pages either. I mean, as I said, I'm about 8 or 9 chapters in. I foresee it going 40, 50 chapters and maybe running 400 or 500 pages in manuscript, which is a bit longer than Tail Chaser Song. Was closer to, as I said, like War of the Flowers or something like that. Anyway, so I'm working on that. We have company coming in the next couple of days, so we've got a lot of stuff to deal with that. I started doing some more work on the office today, realized this may be my last decent weather where I can haul things out to the garage without getting rained on, so I'd better get to work on it. So, not that you can tell, because I haven't put anything up on the walls, and I've still got a bunch of boxes I have to decide what to do with, and that's hinging on other things, like rearranging the garage, et cetera, et cetera. It's, you all know how this works. Any big plan usually hinges on 4 or 5 other plans, things that have to be done. And by the time you get the first one done, then the other 2 or 3 have changed somehow, and you have to recalculate and recalibrate. And of course, the other thing too is that like normal life continues to go on, and I have to work, and I have to answer, queries, and I have to do my household chores and take care of animals and do all that other stuff. So, the dogs are basically okay. Johnny's got a bit of a limp. I don't know how he's got that. It may come from crashing around on the hill and stepping into a gopher hole or a snake burrow or something. Or, God knows, he's a dog. He's a dog. There are times I wish that I had started him out on one of those doggy and cat mats that have little buttons where they can talk. Because maybe I could get a better idea of what had happened to him. But poor old Walter's got like a sore mouth, and he's probably going to lose one of his few remaining teeth. That's something we have to deal with next week. God, let me see. What else? Deb's working. She's sleeping at the moment, but she's working away at various things, including all the boring stuff that she has to do as the business capo of our family, but also she's doing her fabric art as well too, so she's not entirely forced to do only horrible, boring things. And I think that's basically it. In terms of news, I'm beginning to get the drift of Splintered Sun in the sense of how I want to tell the story and all that, which I will tell you more about when I'm further on in the project. But basically, it just has to do with how much like my other Ostenard books it's going to be. And it will be more like my other Ostenard books than, say, Brothers of the Wind, which was, a first-person narrative. And this will be more like the others, more like, well, any of the other Ostenard books, of which there have now been several. And I think that's probably it. right? I think that's it, unless anybody's got any questions or anything like that that they wanted to ask. I see Petra is here also. And who else? Anybody I missed in the first hellos? There's Andre. Hello, Andre. Good to see you. Andre actually asks a question. How do you come up with the titles of your books? They are stylish. Well, thank you. That's very kind. Titling books is always difficult. And because you're juggling two different... Oh, Isaac's here too. Hi, Isaac. You're always juggling two different things. One is the writer's impetus toward poetry, especially the kind of poetry that encapsulates a feeling, a vibe, if you want to get Californian with me. And that's, one thing that's pulling on you. But the other thing that's pulling on you from the other direction is the need to make something that a reader will say, oh, I'm interested in reading that. And that's especially important early on in one's career. By the time you get to my point, there are fortunately a decent amount of readers who know my work and want to read what I'm writing. Thank God for that, and bless you all. But there's also, that need to try and not freak anybody out with something completely incomprehensible. So for instance, I don't think I would have had a book called The Splintered Sun early on because it's poetically interesting, but it doesn't necessarily explain to the reader what kind of thing it is or, anything about it. Again, this is a calculated risk that I feel I can afford to take at this point. But for instance, when I was... Tail Chaser Song was pretty obvious. I mean, that because there's a whole theme of the journey and the life of this character and all that. And he already had a name, which was Tail Chaser, which had significance within the story, and had a kind of a spiritual significance within the story. And song is a word that we understand has more than one meaning. For instance, there's a very famous American made-for-TV movie called Brian's Song about a football player who died of cancer. He was a real guy named Brian Piccolo, and played for the Chicago Bears and was best friends with Gale Sayers, who was one of the greatest players, Chicago Bears players of all time. But anyway, so he got cancer and died, sadly. But the word song in the title, there's nowhere at any point in the movie, or I believe the book it was based on, where anybody sings a song about Brian Piccolo and his struggle with cancer. But it's more the point of his journey, a song in the elegiac sense of somebody celebrating somebody. So that was the way that I was using Tail Chaser's song was with that idea that this is Tail Chaser's journey, this was Tail Chaser's life story, this was his whatever. Now, the Dragon Bone Chair, for instance, I made a very distinct decision there, and I said the obvious thing would be to call it the Dragon Bone Throne. And in fact, that's how it sometimes gets translated in El Trono de Huesos de Dragón, as the Spanish title, and Der Drachenbein-Thron, I believe, the German title. So I don't know if throne has slightly different connotations in those languages, or if it is as clearly meant to be a royal seat as it is in English. But I made a very explicit decision when I was writing the book that, look, I've already got dragon in the title. I was, even at the time, even back in the 1980s, I was constitutionally uncomfortable with the word dragon in the title because it was already a cliche of fantasy fiction. But I figured, well, okay, so first off, if I make it a compound word, dragon bone, okay, now that's an interesting concept because then the question becomes, why are there dragon bones? What is the significance? And if I call it the Dragon Bone Chair instead of the Dragon Bone Throne, I hoped, at the time, that I was opening people up to why a chair? why not a throne? And in fact, it had some resonance and some significance that came out later in the story. But the main thing is I wanted a title that did not sound as obvious as the Dragonbone Throne or the Throne of the Dragon, or something along those lines, which to me just kind of reeked of averageness and ordinariness and genre, mid to bottom of the genre kind of stuff, where you're not trying to do anything interesting at all. Stone of Farewell, same thing. I could have called it the Farewell Stone. I could have called it the Leave-Taking Stone. But I picked a set of words that I thought were more interesting, or an order and stuff. To Green Angel Tower, I deliberately put the 2 on the beginning, in part because I had the idea that right away put motion into it. It's not just Green Angel Tower, but it's the idea of getting to Green Angel Tower, which kind of explained, in a sense, what the whole book was about, was this return that Simon was making to the home where he had grown up and where he had been wonderfully ignorant and sheltered about the outside world, and had gone out on this long journey and almost been killed dozens of times and met all these fascinating, weird, interesting people, some of them who are not human, and that now we were coming full circle. And because indeed it is a book about going home. It's a book about growing up and coming back to look at who you were when you were younger. So I don't want to spend all night on this, because I could go on, and maybe I will at some other point explain how I pick some of the other titles. But just answering Andre's question, what I try to do is to balance between letting people know what kind of a story it is in a general sense, but not in the most cliched sense. So I try to find usages of words, or combinations of words, or even word order that will lift them out a little bit beyond the thing. Will make people I hope will make people ask, what is this? War of the Flowers, which somebody was talking about earlier on my Facebook page. A couple of people were. I mean, that's a pretty obvious example. It has a real meaning in the book, which is the flower families. That's how the families are designated in this fairyland, this very modern fairyland in War of the Flowers. But as a title, just as a title, war and flowers don't usually go together. So, that's what I try to do. I try to do something that lets people know a little bit about the story, but also makes them wonder, what do I not understand here? Why are these words slightly unusual? And I hoped and hope with every book that will make some people, my kind of people, my kind of readers, pick the book up and say, well, it's an interesting title. I'll find out why. Anyway, so that's the idea. One last check here to see if I missed anybody else. And looks like I said hello to mostly everybody. And if I missed anybody, I apologize. Now I am going to return to continuing with Sword in the Stone. And as you may remember from the last episode, Wart, who is enamored, the Wart who is absolutely enamored with the idea of being a soldier, being a knight, going out, getting into fights, having jousts and duels and all that, as, told Merlin essentially, I'm bored. Can I go see some knights fighting? And so Merlin has taken him out by magic to see Sir Grimoire and King Pellinore having a fight. And the first part has been less than edifying, let's put it that way, because they're in this huge heavy armor and they're charging at each other, and they've managed to miss each other the first time, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are. Merlin and Ward are up in a tree, and they're watching Sir Grimoire Grummersome jousting with King Pellinore. King Pellinore, of course, is the guy who chases the questing beast, except, well, that's all later. Anyway, so continuing. First, liquid. They feutred their spears again and thundered into the charge. "Oh," said the ward, "I hope they don't hurt themselves." But the two mounts were patiently blundering together, and the two knights had simultaneously decided on the sweeping stroke. Each held his spear at right angles toward the left, and before the wart could say anything further, there was a terrific yet melodious thump. Clang went the armor, like a motor omnibus in collision with a smithy, and the jousters were sitting side by side on the greensward, while their horses cantered off in opposite directions. "A splendid fall," said Merlin. The two horses pulled themselves up, their duty done, and began resignedly to eat the sward, which is the grass, obviously. King Pellinore and Sir Grummore sat looking straight before them, each with the other's spear clasped hopefully under his arm. "Wow! Well," said the ward, "what a bump! They both seem to be all right so far." Sir Grummore and King Pellinore laboriously got up. "Defend thee!" cried King Pellinore. "God save thee!" cried Sir Grummore. With this they drew their swords and rushed together with such ferocity that each, after dealing the other a dint on the helm, sat down suddenly backwards. "Bah!" cried King Pellinore. "Brr!" cried Sir Grummore, also sitting down. "Mercy!" exclaimed the ward. "What a combat!" The knights had now lost their tempers, and the battle was joined in earnest. It did not matter much, however, for they were so encased in metal that they could not do each other much damage. It took them so long to get up, and the dealing of a blow when you weighed the 1/8 part of a ton was such a cumbrous business that every stage of the contest could be marked and pondered. In the first stage, King Pellinore and Sir Grummore stood opposite each other for about half an hour and walloped each other on the helm. There was only opportunity for one blow at a time, so they more or less took it in turns, King Pellinore striking while Sir Grummore was recovering, and vice versa. At first, if either of them dropped his sword or got it stuck in the ground, the other put in 2 or 3 extra blows while he was patiently fumbling for it or trying to tug it out. Later, they fell into the rhythm of the thing more perfectly, like the toy mechanical people who saw wood on Christmas trees. Eventually, the exercise and the monotony restored their good humor, and they began to get bored. The second stage was introduced as a change, by common consent. Sir Grummore stumped off to one end of the clearing, while King Pellinore plodded off to the other. Then they turned round and swayed backward and forward once or twice in order to get their weight on their toes. When they leaned forward, they had to run forward to keep up with their weight, and if they leaned too far backward, they fell down, so even walking was complicated. When they had got their weight properly distributed in front of them so that they were just off their balance, each broke into a trot to keep up with himself. They hurtled together as it had been 2 boars. They met in the middle breast to breast with a noise of shipwreck and great bells tolling, and both, bouncing off, fell breathless on their backs. They lay thus for a few minutes, panting. Then they slowly began to heave themselves to their feet, and it was obvious that they had lost their tempers once again. King Pellinore had not only lost his temper, but he seemed to have been a bit astonished by the impact. He got up facing the wrong way and could not find Sir Grummore. There was some excuse for this, since he only had a slit to peep through, and that was 3 inches away from his eye, owing to the padding of straw. But he looked muddled as well. Perhaps he had broken his spectacles. Sir Grummore was quick to seize his advantage. "Take that!" cried Sir Grummore, giving the unfortunate monarch a 2-handed swipe on the knob as he was slowly turning his head from side to side, peering in the opposite direction. King Pellinore turned round morosely, but his opponent had been too quick for him. He had ambled round so that he was still behind the king, and now gave him another terrific blow in the same place. "Where are you?" asked King Pellinore. "Here," cried Sir Grummore, giving him another. The poor king turned himself round as nimbly as possible, but Sir Grummore had given him the slip again. "Tally-ho, back!" shouted Sir Grummore with another wallop. "I think you're a cad," said the king. "Wallop!" replied Sir Grummore, doing it. What with the preliminary crash, the repeated blows on the back of his head, and the puzzling nature of his opponent, King Pellinore could now be seen to be visibly troubled in his brains. He swayed backward and forward under the hail of blows which were administered, and feebly wagged his arms. "Poor king," said the ward, "I wish you would not hit him so." As if in answer to his wish, Sir Grummore paused in his labors. "Do you want Pax?" asked Sir Grummore. That means peace. That means to call something off. King Pellinore made no answer. Sir Grummore favored him with another whack and said, "If you don't say Pax, I shall cut your head off." "I won't," said the king. Whang went the sword on the top of his head. Whang it went again. Whang for the third time. "Pax," said King Pellinore, mumbling rather. Then, just as Sir Grummore was relaxing with the fruits of victory, he swung round upon him, shouted "Non!" at the top of his voice, and gave him a good push in the middle of the chest. Sir Grummore fell over backward. "Well," exclaimed the ward, "what a cheat! I would not have thought it of him." King Pellinore hurriedly sat on his victim's chest, thus increasing the weight upon him to 1/4 of a ton, and making it quite impossible for him to move, and began to undo Sir Grummore's helm. "You said Pax." "I said Pax non under my breath. It's a swindle." "It's not. You're a cad." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "I said Pax non." "You said Pax." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did." By this time Sir Grummore's helm was unlaced, and they could see his bare head glaring at King Pellinore, quite purple in the face. "Yield thee, recreant," said the king. "Shan't," said Grummore. "You have got to yield, or I shall cut off your head." "Cut it off, then." "Oh, come on," said the king. "You know you have to yield when your helm is off." "Feign I." That's feign, F-E-I-G-N, like pretend. "Well, I shall just cut your head off." "I don't care." The king waved his sword menacingly in the air. "Go on," said Sir Grummore. "I dare you to." The king lowered his sword and said, "Oh, I say, do yield, please." "You yield." "But I can't yield. I am on top of you, after all, am I not? What?" "Well, I have feigned yielding." "Oh, come on, Grummore. I do think you are a cad not to yield. You know very well I can't cut your head off." "I would not yield to a cheat who started fighting after he said Pax." "I am not a cheat." "You are a cheat." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." "Very well," said King Pellinore. "You can jolly well get up and put on your helm, and we will have a fight. I won't be called a cheat for anybody." "Cheat," said Sir Grummore. They stood up and fumbled together with the helm, hissing, "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are," until it was safely on. Then they retreated to opposite ends of the clearing, got their weight upon their toes, and came rumbling and thundering together like two runaway trams. Unfortunately, they were now so cross that they had both ceased to be vigilant, and in the fury of the moment they missed each other altogether. The momentum of their armor was too great for them to stop till they had passed each other handsomely, and then they maneuvered about in such a manner that neither happened to come within the range of the other's vision. It was funny watching them, because King Pellinore, having already been caught from behind once, was continually spinning around to look behind him. and Sir Grummore, having used the stratagem himself, was doing the same thing. Thus they wandered for some 5 minutes, standing still, listening, clanking, crouching, creeping, peering, walking on tiptoe, and occasionally making a chance swipe behind their backs. Once they were standing within a few feet of each other, back to back, only to stalk off in opposite directions with infinite precaution. And once King Pellinore did hit Sir Grummore with one of his backstrokes, but they both immediately spun round so often that they became giddy and mislaid each other afresh. After 5 minutes, Sir Grummore said, "All right, Pellinore, it is no use hiding. I can see where you are." "I am not hiding," exclaimed King Pellinore indignantly. "Where am I?" They discovered each other and went up close together, face to face. "Cad," said Sir Grummore. "Yeah," said King Pellinore. They turned round and marched off to their corners, seething with indignation. "Swindler!" shouted Sir Grummore. "Beastly bully!" shouted King Pellinore. With this they summoned all their energies together for one decisive encounter, leaned forward, lowered their heads like two billy goats, and positively sprinted together for the final blow. Alas, their aim was poor. They missed each other by about 5 yards, passed at full steam, doing at least 8 knots, like ships that pass in the night but speak not to each other in passing, and hurtled onward to their doom. Both knights began waving their arms like windmills, anti-clockwise, in the vain effort to slow up. Both continued with undiminished speed. Then Sir Grummore rammed his head against the beech tree in which the wart was sitting, and King Pellinore collided with a chestnut at the other side of the clearing. The trees shook. The forest rang. Blackbirds and squirrels cursed, and wood pigeons flew out of their leafy perches half a mile away. The two knights stood to attention while one could count 3. Then, with a last unanimous, melodious clang, they both fell prostrate on the fatal sward. "Stunned?" said Merlin. "I should think." "Oh dear," said the ward. "Ought we to get down and help them?" "We could pour water on their heads," said Merlin reflectively, "if there was any water. But I don't suppose they would thank us for making their armor rusty. They will be all right. Besides, it is time that we were home." "But they might be dead." "They are not dead, I know. In a minute or 2 they will come round and go off home to dinner." "Poor King Pellinore has not got a home." "Then Sir Grummore will invite him to stay the night. They will be the best of friends when they come to. They always are." "Do you think so?" "My dear boy, I know so. Shut your eyes, and we will be off." The wart gave in to Merlin's superior knowledge. "Do you think," he asked with his eyes shut, "that Sir Grummore has a feather bed?" "Probably." "Good," said the wart. "That will be nice for King Pellinore, even if he was stunned." The Latin words were spoken, and the secret passes made. The funnel of whistling noise and space received them. In 2 seconds they were lying under the grandstand, and the sergeant's voice was calling from the opposite side of the tilting ground. "Now then, Master Art, now then, you've been a snoozing there long enough. Come on, into the sunlight here with Master K. 1, 2, 1, 2, and see some real tilting." Chapter 8. It was a cold, wet evening, such as may happen even toward the end of August, and the wart did not know how to bear himself indoors. He spent some time in the kennels talking to Keival, then wandered off to help them turn the spit in the kitchen, but there it was too hot. He was not forced to stay indoors because of the rain, by his female supervisors, as happens too frequently to the unhappy children of our generation, but the mere wetness and dreariness in the open discouraged him from going out. He hated everybody. "Confound the boy," said Sir Ector. For goodness sake, stop moping by that window there and go find your tutor. When I was a boy, we always used to study on wet days. Yes, and educate our minds." "Ward is stupid," said Kay. "Run along, my duck," said their old nurse. "I han't got time to attend to thy mopsies now, what with all this sorbent washing." "Now then, my young master," said Hob, "let thee run off to thy quarters, and stop confusing thy fowls." Nah," said the sergeant. "You up orf out of here. I got enough to do a polishing of this bare lady armor." Even the dog boy barked at him when he went back to the kennels. Wart draggled off to the tower room, where Merlin was busy knitting himself a woolen nightcap for the winter. "I cast off 2 together at every other line," said the magician, "but for some reason it seems to end too sharply, like an onion. It is the turning of the heel that does one, every time." "I think I ought to have some education," said the wart. "I can't think of anything to do." "You think that education is something which ought to be done when all else fails?" inquired Merlin nastily, for he was in a bad mood too. "Well," said the wart, "some sorts of education." "Mine?" asked the magician with flashing eyes. "Oh, Merlin," exclaimed the wart without answering, "please give me something to do, because I feel so miserable. Nobody wants me for anything today, and I just don't know how to be sensible. It rains so." "You should learn to knit." "Could I go out and be something, a fish or anything like that?" "You have been a fish," said Merlin. "Nobody with any go needs to do their education twice." "Well, could I be a bird?" "If you knew anything at all," said Merlin, "which you do not, you would know that a bird does not like to fly in the rain because it wets its feathers and makes them stick together. They get bedraggled." "I could be a hawk in Hobbs' Mews," said the wart stoutly. "Then I should be indoors and not get wet." "That is pretty ambitious," said the old man, "to want to be a hawk." "You know you will turn me into a hawk when you want to," shouted the wart, "but you like to plague me because it is wet. I won't have it." "Hoity-toity!" "Please," said the wart, "dear Merlin, turn me into a hawk. If you don't do that, I shall do something. I don't know what." Merlin put down his knitting and looked at his pupil over the top of his spectacles. "My boy," he said, "you shall be everything in the world. Animal, vegetable, mineral, protista, or virus, for all I care before I have done with you, but you will have to trust to my superior backsight. The time is not yet right for you to be a hawk. For one thing, Hob is still in the mews feeding them, so you may as well sit down for the moment and learn to be a human being." "Very well," said the wart, "if that's a no," and he sat down. After several minutes he said, "Is one allowed to speak as a human being, or does the thing about being seen and not heard have to apply?" "Everybody can speak." "That's good, because I wanted to mention that you have been knitting your beard into the nightcap for 3 rows now." "What? "I should think the best thing would be to cut off the end of your beard. Shall I fetch some scissors?" "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I wanted to see what would happen." "You run a grave risk, my boy," said the magician, "of being turned into a piece of bread and toasted." With this he slowly began to unpick his beard, muttering to himself meanwhile, and taking the greatest precautions not to drop a stitch. "Will it be as difficult to fly," asked the wart, when he thought his tutor had calmed down, "as it was to swim?" "You will not need to fly. I don't mean to turn you into a loose hawk, but only to set you in the mews for the night, so that you can talk to the others. That is the way to learn, by listening to the experts. Will they talk? They talk every night, deep into the darkness. They say about how they were taken, about what they can remember of their homes, about their lineage and the great deeds of their ancestors, about their training and what they have learned and will learn. It is military conversation, really, like you might have in the mess of a crack cavalry regiment. Tactics, small arms, maintenance, betting, famous hunts, wine, women, and song. Another subject they have, he continued, is food. It is a depressing thought, but of course they are mainly trained by hunger. They are a hungry lot, poor chaps, thinking of the best restaurants where they used to go and how they had champagne and caviar and gypsy music. Of course, they all come of noble blood. What a shame that they should be kept prisoners and be hungry. Well, they do not really understand that they are prisoners any more than the cavalry officers do. They look on themselves as being dedicated to their profession, like an order of knighthood or something of that sort. You see, the membership of the Mews is, after all, restricted to the Raptors, and that does help a lot. They know that none of the lower classes can get in. Their screen perches don't hold blackbirds or such as that. And then, as to the hungry part, they are far from starving or that kind of hunger. They're in training, you know, and like everybody in strict training, they think about food. How soon can I begin? You can begin now if you want to. My insight tells me that Hob has this minute finished for the night. But, first of all, you must choose what kind of hawk you would prefer to be. I should like to be a merlin, said the wart politely. The answer flattered the magician. A very good choice, he said, and if you please, we will proceed at once. The wart got up from his stool and stood in front of his tutor. Merlin put down his knitting. First you go small, said he, pressing him on the top of his head until he was a bit smaller than a pigeon. Then you stand on the ball of your toes. Bend at the knees, hold your elbows to your sides, and lift your hands to the level of your shoulders. Then press your first and second fingers together, as also your third and fourth. Look, it is like this. With these words, the ancient necromancer stood upon tiptoe and did as he had explained. The wart copied him carefully and wondered what would happen next. What did happen was that Merlin, who had been saying the final spells under his breath, suddenly turned himself into a condor, leaving the wart standing on tiptoe, unchanged. He stood there as if he were drying himself in the sun, with a wingspread of about 11 feet, a bright orange head, and a magenta carbuncle. He looked surprised, and rather funny. "Come back," said the wart. "You've changed the wrong one." "It is this, by Our Lady spring cleaning," exclaimed Merlin, turning back into himself. "Once you let a woman into your study for half an hour, you do not know where to lay your hands on the right spell, not if it was ever so. Stand up, and we will try again." This time the now tiny wart felt his toes shooting out and scratching on the floor. He felt his heels rise and stick out behind, and his knees draw into his stomach. His thighs became quite short. A web of skin grew from his wrists to his shoulders, while his primary feathers burst out in soft blue quills from the ends of his fingers and quickly grew. His secondaries sprouted along his forearms, and a charming little false primary sprang from the end of each thumb. The dozen feathers of his tail, with the double-deck feathers in the middle, grew out in the twinkling of an eye, and all the covert feathers of his back and breast and shoulders slipped out of the skin to hide the roots of the more important plumes. Wart looked quickly at Merlin, ducked his head between his legs and had a look through there, rattled his feathers into place, and began to scratch his chin with the sharp talon of one toe. "Good," said Merlin. "Now, hop on my hand. Be careful and don't gripe, and listen to what I have to tell you. I shall take you into the mews now that Hob has locked up for the night, and I shall put you loose and unhooded beside Balin and Balan. Now pay attention. Don't go close to anybody without speaking first. You must remember that most of them are hooded and might be startled into doing something rash. You can trust Balin and Balan, and also the Kestrel and the Sparhawk. Don't go within reach of the falcon unless she invites you to. On no account must you stand beside Cully's special enclosure, for he is unhooded and will go for you through the mesh if he gets half a chance. He is not quite right in his brains, poor chap, and if he once grips you, you will never leave his grip alive. Remember that you are visiting a kind of Spartan military mess. These fellows are regulars. As the junior subaltern, your only business is to keep your mouth shut, speak when you are spoken to, and not interrupt." "I bet I am more than a subaltern," said the wart, "if I am a Merlin." "Well, as a matter of fact, you are. You will find that both the Kestrel and the Sparhawk will be polite to you, but for all sake's sake, don't interrupt the senior Merlins or the Falcon. She is the honorary colonel of the regiment. And as for Cully, well, he is a colonel too, even if he is infantry, so you must mind your P's and Q's." "I will be careful," said the wart, who was beginning to feel rather scared. "Good. I shall come for you in the morning before Hob is up." All the hawks were silent as Merlin carried their new companion into the mews, and silent for some time afterward when they had been left in the dark. The rain had given place to a full August moonlight, so clear that you could see a woolly bear caterpillar 15 yards away out of doors as it climbed up and up the knobbly sandstone of the great keep. And it took Wart only a few moments for his eyes to become accustomed to the diffused brightness inside the mews. The darkness became watered with light, with silver radiance, and then it was an eerie sight which dawned upon his vision. Each hawk or falcon stood in the silver upon one leg, the other tucked up inside the apron of its panel, and each was a motionless statue of a knight in armor. They stood gravely in their plumed helmets, spurred and armed. The canvas or sacking screens of their perches moved heavily in a breath of wind, like banners in a chapel, and the rapt nobility of the air kept their night's vigil in knightly patience. In those days they used to hood everything they could, even the goshawk and the merlin, which are no longer hooded according to modern practice. Wart drew his breath at the sight of all these stately figures, standing so still that they might have been cut of stone. He was overwhelmed by their magnificence, and felt no need of Merlin's warning that he was to be humble and behave himself. Presently there was a gentle ringing of a bell. The great peregrine falcon had bestirred herself, and now said in a high, nasal voice which came from her aristocratic nose, "Gentlemen, you may converse." There was dead silence. Only in the far corner of the room, which had been netted off for Cully, loose there, unhooded and deep in molt, they could hear a faint muttering from the choleric infantry colonel. "Damned," he was mumbling, "damned administration, damned politician, damned Bolsheviks. Is this a damned dagger that I see before me, the handle toward my hand? Damned spot! Now, Cully, hast thou but one brief hour to live, and then thou must be damned perpetually." "Colonel," said the peregrine coldly, "not before the younger officers." "I beg your pardon, ma'am. said the poor colonel at once. "It is something that gets into my head, you know. Some deep damnation." There was silence again, formal, terrible, and calm. "Who is the new officer?" inquired the first fierce and beautiful voice. Nobody answered. "Speak for yourself, sir," commanded the peregrine, looking straight before her as if she were talking in her sleep. They could not see him through their hoods. "Please," began the wart, "I am a Merlin," and he stopped, scared in the stillness. Balan, who was one of the real Merlins standing beside him, leaned over and whispered quite kindly in his ear, "Don't be afraid. Call her madam." "I am a Merlin, madam, and it please you?" "A Merlin? That is good. And what branch of the Merlins do you stoop from?" The wart did not know in the least what branch he stooped from, but he dared not be found out now in his lie. "Madam," he said, "I am one of the Merlins of the Forest Sauvage." There was silence at this again, the silver silence which he had begun to fear. "There are the Yorkshire Merlins," said the honorary colonel in her slow voice at last, "and the Welsh Merlins and the Macmerlins of the north. Then there are the Salisbury ones, and several from the neighbourhood of Exmoor, and the O'Merlins of Connaught. I do not think I have heard of any family in the Forest Sauvage." "It would be a cadet branch, madam," said Balan. "I dare say." "Bless him," thought Wart. "I shall catch him a special sparrow tomorrow and give it to him behind Hobbs' back." "That will be the solution, Captain Balan, no doubt." The silence fell again. At last the peregrine rang her bell. She said, "We will proceed with the catechism prior to swearing him in." The wart heard the sparhawk on his left give several nervous coughs at this, but the peregrine paid no attention. "Merlin of the Forest Sauvage," said the peregrine, "what is a beast of the foot?" "A beast of the foot," replied the wart, blessing his stars that Sir Ector had chosen to give him a first-rate education, "is a horse, or a hound, or a hawk." "Why are these called beasts of the foot?" "Because these beasts depend upon the powers of their feet, so that by law any damage to the feet of hawk, hound, or horse is reckoned as damage to its life. A lamed horse is a murdered horse." "Good," said the peregrine. "What are your most important members?" "My wings," said the wart after a moment, guessing because he did not know. At this there was a simultaneous tintinnabulation of all the bells as each graven image lowered its raised foot in distress. They stood on both feet now, disturbed. "Your what?" called the peregrine sharply. "He said his damned wings," said Colonel Cully from his private enclosure, "and damned be he who first cries, 'Hold, enough!'" "But even a thrush has wings," cried the kestrel, speaking for the first time in his sharp-beaked alarm. "Think," whispered Balan under his breath. The wart thought feverishly. A thrush had wings, tail, eyes, legs, apparently everything. "My talons!" "It will do," said the peregrine kindly, after one of her dreadful pauses. "The answer ought to be feet, just as it is to all the other questions, but talons will do." All the hawks, and of course we are using the term loosely, for some were hawks and some were falcons, raised their belled feet again and sat at ease. "What is the first law of the foot?" Think, said friendly little Balin behind his false primary. The wart thought, and thought right. Never to let go, he said. Last question, said the peregrine. How would you, as a merlin, kill a pigeon bigger than yourself? Wart was lucky on this one, for he had heard Hob giving a description of how Balin did it one afternoon, and he answered warily, I should strangle her with my foot. Good, said the peregrine. Bravo, cried the others, raising their feathers. 90%, said the sparhawk after a quick sum. That is, if you give him a half for the talons. The devil damn me black! Colonel, please. Balin whispered to the wart, Colonel Cully is not quite right in his wits. It is his liver, we believe, but the kestrel says it is the constant strain of living up to her ladyship's standard. He says that her ladyship spoke to him from her full social station once, cavalry to infantry, you know, and that he just closed his eyes and got the vertigo. He has never been the same since. And that's where we're going to stop for the night, because the scene goes on for a while longer. But I'm going to hang it up right here. So, that being the case, I want to thank you all for the kindness of your company. And, and look, I've got a few new people who weren't here before. There's Olaf and Bernhardt. So good to see you both. And anybody else that I haven't already said hello to, I'm thinking of you. So, anyway, so here we are. And I am now finished for the evening. So I will tell you I'll be back at 7 p.m. later today. Tomorrow for me, later today, in the strictest 24-hour sense of things. Until that point, until we meet again, either later today, some other point, somewhere up the road, over the rainbow, under a tree, beneath a mushroom, wherever it may happen to be, take good care of yourselves. Take good care of your loved ones and your friends, your neighbors. We all need to look out for each other. That's how we're going to make it through. Peace, and thank you all for joining me. As always, it's been a great pleasure, and I will see you very soon. Ciao.